Dear girls, today I'll be starting the short story The Black Whale by Charles Dickens. Now, Charles Dickens, as you all know, he was a British novelist, he was a journalist, he was an editor, also, he was a social commentator, and he has written classic novels like Oliver Twist, Christmas Carol, Nicholas, Nickleby, David Copperfield, A Tale of Two Cities, and Great Expectations. And Dickens is basically one of the most important and influential writers of the 19th century. So you find Charles John Huffman Dickens, 1812 to 1870. He was an English writer and social critic, and he has created some of the world's best known fictional characters and is regarded by many as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. His works enjoyed the unprecedented popularity during his lifetime, and by 20th century, critics and scholars had recognized him as a literary genius. The term Dickensian is used to describe something that is reminiscent of Dickens and his writings, such as poor social conditions or comically repulsive characters. And as I've already mentioned, his notable works are The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Bleak House, Little Dorrit, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. The Black Whale is a Gothic tale by Dickens and first published in 1836. So, this is a Gothic tale which is written by Dickens. And if you look at this particular genre, the Gothic novel, you understand that it has a very long history, dates back to the 18th century. And if you look at the first Gothic novel, it was Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. That is considered as a Gothic novel. And I'm sure you would have read or at least watched movies like Dracula, and these are other examples of Gothic literature. But what exactly does it contain? So you find Gothic fiction basically has elements of horror and romanticism. You have supernatural events, characters that occur in nature, and these are which cannot be easily explained, and you find the plot of such novels, it will be filled with suspense and mystery. And if you look at the common elements that you would find in Gothic novels and stories, you would find that from the very setting, the plot, as well as characters, you will find a sort of a gloom, uh, decay. You will find supernatural beings, monsters. You will have curses, prophecies. There would also be this, I would say, a sense of madness. There would be a touch of madness too in these novels. So now let us come to the story, The Black Whale. It is the year 1800 or thereabouts, and a young doctor has recently opened his own surgery. All he is waiting for is his first patient. Late one night, a woman dressed in mourning attire and black veil is admitted to see the doctor. Her identity is completely hidden beneath the fabric, and although the doctor cannot make out any of her features except that she is a singularly tall lady, he can feel her eyes on him, watching him, but she doesn't speak. Eventually, the doctor breaks the silence and asks whether there is anything he can do for her. By this time, he has come to the conclusion that she might be a local mad woman. Finally, she declares that she is very ill, but that she is there on behalf of another, one whose condition is grave. In reply, the doctor announces that a moment cannot be lost if this person is as ill as she claims, and he will attend them at once. But rather bizarrely, the woman says no, it would be useless. Instead, she instructs him to come at 9 o'clock the next day morning. The doctor protests, saying that it makes no sense to pull it off. It surely will only make matters worse. But the woman is not moved. Before she leaves, she gives vague directions as to where the doctor can find them tomorrow and then makes her exit. But what awaits the doctor the following morning? And is he really too late to be of any use? So you find there is a lot of suspense and mystery in the story. So if you look at the setting, it is set in the year 1800. It's a story about a young doctor who has opened up his own clinic, and he wants or he's waiting for his first patient. And so far, he has had none. Days pass and he's still waiting anxiously for his first patient. And one late night, a mysterious visitor arrives at his doorstep, and it is a woman who is in a mourning attire, and she has a black veil. And she seems, from the very outset, she seems to be rather a unique and mysterious woman. She's very tall, a very tall lady, but you find the doctor cannot, he cannot see her clearly because she is hidden behind her thick veil. And eventually, you find there is conversation between the doctor and the woman has a very strange request, and you find that particular event, that incident on that particular day ends with the doctor promising this visitor, this mysterious black woman wearing a black veil. He promises her that he would visit her house the next day at 9 o'clock. And then she leaves. And you find that the surgeon, this young doctor, he has a very restless night. He's not able to sleep. And then what happens to him the next day, that basically carries on, or that becomes the suspense, that adds to the suspense of the story. One winter's evening towards the close of the year 1800, or within a year or two of that time, a young medical practitioner, recently established in business, was seated by a cheerful fire in his little parlor, listening to the wind which was beating the rain in pattering drops against the window or rumbling dismally in the chimney. The night was wet and cold. He had been walking through mud and water the whole day and was now comfortably reposing in his dressing gown and slippers, more than half asleep and less than half awake, revolving a thousand matters in his wandering imagination. So the story begins with a very detailed description about the season, about the kind of climate the young surgeon is uh, facing. You find it is winter evening, and he's seated by a cheerful fire. It's very cold outside. There is rain. The night is wet and cold, and he knows that he's had a very tough morning. He had been walking through mud and water, and now he's in his dressing gown and slippers. He's very comfortable, and you find he's almost dozing off because he's half asleep and half awake. And he's thinking about a lot of things. There are a lot of unresolved matters, and these are the things that he thinks about. Now, first, he thought how hard the wind was blowing, and how the cold, sharp rain would be at that moment beating in his face if he were not comfortably housed at home. So he's thinking about the weather. It begins with the first thought that comes to his mind is about the weather, how wet and damp and cold it is out there, and he feels blessed that he is now not out there facing the harsh climate, but rather he is comfortably housed at home in front of a cheerful fire which is keeping him warm. Then he, his mind, he thinks about the annual Christmas visit to his native place and dearest friends. So the second thought he has is of his regular annual Christmas visit that he does. He goes to his native place, and that is when he meets his dear friends, and he thought how glad they would all be to see him and how happy it would make Rose if he could only tell her that he has found a patient at last and hope to have more and to come down again in a few months' time and marry her and take her home to gladden his lonely fireside and stimulate him to fresh exertions. Now, his mind wanders to his annual Christmas visit, and that naturally leads him to think about other pleasant things like the lady that he loves, that is Rose, and he's excited. He imagines that he would have good news, that he'll be able to give Rose about his new clinic, about the new patients that he's had, and that he has enough money, that he will have enough money to set aside for their marriage, and he'll be able to marry her, and he would be able to spend a wonderful time with his lady love, that is Rose. Then he begins to wonder when his first patient would appear, or whether he was destined by a special dispensation of providence never to have any patients at all. And then he thought about Rose again, and then he began to wonder about his first patient, as to who will be his first patient. He's clearly too young. He's a young surgeon. He wants to have his first patient, and he wonders as to what kind of patient he's going to have. And then he wonders whether he will ever have patients, because he feels that he's unlucky because he's not had any patients so far. Ever since he set up his clinic, he's not had a single patient, and he wonders what's going to happen. And then very soon he once again begins to think about Rose, and then dropped to sleep and dreamed about her. So once again, you find he begins to doze off, and as he falls asleep, he dreams about his girlfriend, or his fiancée rather, Rose, till the tones of a sweet, merry voice sounded in his ears, and her soft, tiny hand rested on his shoulder. So once again, he begins to think about his lady love Rose, and how she would speak to him in her clear, sweet, merry voice. And then he imagines her soft, tiny hands resting on his shoulders when there was a hand upon his shoulder, but it was neither soft nor tiny. And then suddenly he actually feels a hand on his shoulder, and it is not soft or tiny, its owner being a corpulent, round headed boy. And then he realizes that the owner of that hand is not his lady love Rose, but rather it is this a pudgy, overweight, round headed boy who, in consideration of the sum of 1 shilling per week and his food, was let out by the parish to carry medicine and messages. As there was no demand for the medicine, however, and no necessity for the messages, he usually occupied his unemployed hours, averaging 14 a day, in abstracting peppermint drops, taking animal nourishment, and going to sleep. So now here he talks about his assistant, a rather curious young boy who was hired, who was actually hired or borrowed by the parish. He was allowed to have this little boy as an assistant, by the parish so that he could, carry medicines and messages. Now, since this is a new practice, there has so far been no demand for medicines, and since he did not really have any patients, there was no necessity for messages either. So this boy, he used to occupy, he was quite unemployed, so most of the time he was very free, and those hours he would extract peppermint drops, and he would take animal nourishment, and he used to go to sleep. So that was the only thing that the boy used to do. But now suddenly the boy comes and says, "A lady, sir, a lady," whispered the boy, rousing his master with a shake. So you find this young boy comes and, shakes the young surgeon, rouses his master with a shake. And you find uh, this man, he is surprised. He says, "What lady?" cried our friend, starting up, not quite certain that his dream was an illusion and half expecting that it might be Rose herself. And you have to remember, this young surgeon was asleep and he was dreaming about Rose. So when he was suddenly woken up, he was not very sure whether it was a dream or an illusion. He was almost, expecting Rose to be right next to him. "What lady? Where?" he says. "There, sir," replied the boy, pointing to the glass door leading into the surgery with an expression of alarm which the very unusual apparition of a customer might have tended to excite. So you find this boy, his assistant, points to the glass door, and this boy looks rather alarmed, and he says, "No, there is maybe it is a sight of an unexpected visitor that must have alarmed him," he says. Now the surgeon looked towards the door and started himself for an instant on beholding the appearance of his unlooked for visitor. Now, suddenly, when they looked, this man wondered, the surgeon was wondering as to why this boy had this very strange reaction. And when he himself looked towards the door, he was startled himself because of the appearance of this visitor. It was a singularly tall woman. So, this visitor was an extremely tall sort of a woman, dressed in deep mourning and standing so close to the door that her face almost touched the glass. The upper part of her figure was carefully muffled, meaning it was wrapped in a black shawl as if for the purpose of concealment, and her face was shrouded by a thick black veil. She stood perfectly erect. Her figure was drawn up to its full height, and though the surgeon felt that the eyes beneath the veil were fixed on him, she stood perfectly motionless and evinced by no gesture whatever the slightest consciousness of his having turned towards her. So this woman looked very strange because it was a very tall woman and she was dressed in deep mourning. So she was dressed in black and she was standing very close to the door. It looked as if her face was kind of touching the glass. And you find her upper part of her figure, she was cloaked, she was wrapped in black shawl, as if she's trying to hide herself. And her face was completely or almost completely hidden by thick black veil, and she was standing in a very her posture was quite different or strange because she stood perfectly erect and her figure was drawn up. She was not slouching, but rather she was standing erect, straight, so straight that her figure was drawn up to its full height. And though the surgeon felt the eyes beneath the veil were fixed on him, she stood perfectly motionless and evinced by no gesture whatever the slightest consciousness of his having turned towards her. And this lady, this stranger, did not show any kind of reaction to this man turning towards her. Usually, when somebody looks at you, you would show some reaction. But here, this woman did not move like a statue. She stood there motionless without any gesture. Do you wish to consult me? He inquired, with some hesitation, holding open the door. It opened inwards, and therefore the action did not alter the position of the figure, which still remained motionless on the same spot. She slightly inclined her head in token of acquiescence. Pray, walk in, said the surgeon. The figure moved a step forward and then, turning its head in the direction of the boy, to his infinite horror, appeared to hesitate. Leave the room, Tom, said the young man, addressing the boy, whose large round eyes had been extended to their outmost width during this brief interview. Draw the curtain and shut the door. So, after uh, observing this visitor of his, finally he inquired, do you want to consult me? Do you want to uh, talk to me about anything? And then slowly this woman, she inclined her head, telling him yes. So the surgeon said, please walk in. And this woman, she stepped forward and turned her head towards this young boy, and he was startled. This young boy was horrified. His eyes had extended to their utmost width during this brief interview. This brief exchange of glances had horrified this young boy. And this figure, this woman, hesitated. She took a step forward and then she stopped. Then you find the doctor advising this young boy to leave the room, to draw the curtain, give them privacy, and shut the door. The boy drew a green curtain across the glass part of the door, retired into the surgery, closed the door after him, and immediately applied one of his large eyes to the keyhole on the other side. So, being an assistant, he was very obedient. He did draw the green curtain across the glass part of the door and then retired into the surgery. But once he closed the door after him, immediately he peeped through the keyhole on the other side. The surgeon drew a chair to the fire and motioned the visitor to a seat. The mysterious figure slowly moved towards it. As the blaze shone upon the black dress, the surgeon observed that the bottom of it was saturated with mud and rain. This woman had walked through all that, harsh weather and cold rain, and therefore her dress was saturated with mud and rain. You are very wet, he said. I am, said the stranger in a low, deep voice. And you are ill? Asked the surgeon compassionately, for the tone was that of a person in pain. Now, you find the narrator or the doctor here, he asks this lady, are you ill? And she says she is. And her tone reveals that, she is really ill. She sounded to be in pain. So she says, I am, was the reply, very ill, not bodily, but mentally. It is not for myself or on my own behalf, continued the stranger, that I come to you. If I labored under bodily disease, I should not be out alone at such an hour or on such a night as this. And if I were afflicted with it 24 hours hence, God knows how gladly I would lie down and pray to die. It is for another that I beseech your aid, sir. So she says, yes, I am ill, but not the kind of ill that you think I am. I am not physically, I'm not physically ill. There is nothing ailing me physically, but I am mentally sick. There is something in me that I need to cure. And then she says, if I come under bodily disease, I should not be. If it is physical ailment, I would not have taken the trouble to come at this point, at this hour, on such a day or on such a night. If I were afflicted with it 24 hours hence, God knows how gladly I would lie down and pray to die. Now, if this was 24 hours from now, and if I was sick, then I would hope and I would pray that I would die. But she says, it is not for me that I am here. It is not for any sickness of mine, but it is for another. I beg your help, she says. I may be mad to ask it for him, I think I am, but night after night, through the long dreary hours of watching and weeping, the thought has been ever present to my mind. And though even I see the hopelessness of human assistance availing him, the bare thought of laying him in his grave without it makes my blood run cold, and a shudder such as the surgeon well knew art could not produce trembled through the speaker's frame. So you find this woman seems to be rather distraught, and she says that she's here not for herself but for someone else. And then she talks about how she knows her situation is helpless, and that this person that she wants to a cure seems to be in a horrible sort of a situation, seems to be in a very grave situation, and she does not want to lay him in his grave, she says. And then she starts shaking and shivering, and again it is indicative of how much she's suffering within. And it is this earnestness, the desperate situation, that makes the surgeon change his mind. So he says there was a desperate earnestness, there was a desperate earnestness in this woman's manner that went to the young man's heart. He was young in his profession and had not yet witnessed enough of the miseries which are daily presented before the eyes of its members to have grown comparatively callous to human suffering. We find this is a young surgeon. He has not witnessed miseries, enough of miseries. So you find he's still empathetic. After a while, after you see a lot of cases, your heart basically it becomes cold, you become jaded. But here you find the young surgeon, he is still compassionate, he's filled with compassion and empathy. So now he says, if, he said, rising hastily, the person of whom you speak be in so hopeless a condition as you describe, not a moment is to be lost. So he says, if the person you're referring to is in such a dire situation, then it is stupid, it is folly, it is so silly that we sit here and talk about it when we should actually be there taking care of such a person. So he says, I will go with you instantly. Why did you not obtain medical advice before? Because it would have been useless before, because it is useless even now, replied the woman, clasping her hands passionately. This man, he's so touched by this condition of this woman. He asks her, if he was in such a bad condition, why didn't you take him to uh, a doctor earlier? You should have taken him to a doctor sooner and not later. But this woman says, it would have been useless earlier. It would have been useless if I had taken that person earlier. And even now, it is useless, she says. The surgeon gazed for a moment on the black veil as if to ascertain, as if to determine the expression of the features beneath it. Its thickness, however, rendered such a result impossible. So that woman says, if I had taken him earlier, that would have been useless. If you come now, it's still going to be useless. And this surgeon is completely bewildered. He's completely confused. He looks at her, trying to gauge from her expression what exactly she's trying to get at. Then finally, he says, "You are ill. Although you do not know it, the fever which has enabled you to bear without feeling it, the fatigue you have evidently undergone, is burning within you now. Put that to your lips," he continued, pouring out a glass of water. "Compose yourself for a few moments, and then tell me, as calmly as you can, what the disease of the patient is and how long he has been ill. When I know what is necessary, I should know to render my visit serviceable to him. I am ready to accompany you." So he realizes that maybe this woman is really sick. Maybe it's because she has a fever, that she's rambling, and there is absolutely no sense to what she says. So he gives her a glass of water and tells her, why don't you compose yourself, calm down, and then you can tell me very calmly as to who this patient is, what that man's disease is, and for how long he has been ill. Now, when I know all these conditions, when I'm sure about my patient, then I'll be able to accompany you and I'll be able to help you out, he says. The stranger lifted the glass of water to her mouth without raising the veil, put it down again untasted, and burst into tears. So this woman is about to drink water, but then decides not to the last moment, and then she puts it down and then bursts into tears. "I know," she said, sobbing aloud, "that what I say to you now seems like the ravings of fever." She says, "Yes, I know that you think that I am mad and it is this fever that is making me mad. My wild talk and my rambling. I'm sure you think it is because of my fever. I have been told so before, less kindly than by you. I am not a young woman, and they do say that as life steals on towards its final close, the last short remnant, worthless as it may seem to all beside, is dearer to its possessor than all the years that have gone before, connected though they be with the recollection of old friends long since dead, and young ones, children perhaps, who have fallen off from and forgotten one as completely as if they had died too. My natural term of life cannot be many years longer, and should be dear on that account, but I would lay it down without a sigh, with cheerfulness, with joy, if what I tell you now were only false or imaginary. So now she tells him, "Yes, I'm sure you think that I am mad, but trust me, I've been to others and they have told me that I am mad, but they were less kind. They were less kinder. You are far kinder than those people who have shunned me, saying that I am mad." And she says, "I am not a young woman, and I am old," she says. "I am about to die. It is at the final close. And even though it is worthless, my life should be dearer to me." But she says, "I am ready. I am ready to leave it all. I'm I would lay down my life without a sigh if what I about to tell you was false or imaginary." He says, "Whatever I'm going to tell you is truth. It's absolutely true. And therefore, tomorrow morning, he of whom I speak will be, I know, though I should fain think otherwise, beyond the reach of human aid. And yet tonight, though he is in deadly peril, you must not see and could not serve him." So now you find the woman telling him about this very unnatural, very confusing sort of a situation. So she tells him that, what I'm about to tell you is true. It's absolutely true. The situation is like this, she says. The person I'm talking to you about, this patient I'm referring to, tomorrow morning, I know he will be beyond the reach of human aid. Morning, it will be too much, it will be too late. And tonight, he is in deadly peril, he is in danger. But tonight, you cannot see him, and tonight, you cannot help him. And tomorrow, even if you do come, you will not be able to help him.